Welcome to another edition of Whole Hog Politics. I'm Bill Sammon. I'm with the Hill and News Nation, and I'm joined as usual by Chris Stirewalt, author of the Whole Hog Politics newsletter and host of the Hill Sunday show on News Nation. Chris, I got to imagine you were as surprised as I was when the conclave elected the first American pope. Um, but I tell you, I was reading your column and I was also surprised by a statistic you included that I guess I didn't know or I'd forgotten about, and that is the following. Just last November, Catholics in the United States voted for Donald Trump by a margin of 59%, and only 39% of them voted for Harris. 20% advantage for Republicans. And it was so striking to me because, I grew up in an Irish Catholic neighborhood in Cleveland in the 60s. And in those days, it felt like the Catholics were a reliably Democratic voting bloc. Is that true? And if so, what has changed?
Well, let me tell you, when I was writing that, and our colleague Ian Swanson saw the consequences, the news broke during as I'm putting the note together. The story broke, and I wanted to acknowledge the historic moment of the first American Pope, but I didn't want to get into it's already a political football. Is the Pope a woke Pope, or is he an anti-JD Vance Pope? Is he a never Trump Pope? Is he a what Pope?
It's a registered Republican.
Right. And for me, I'm not Catholic, and
Yeah.
I find it all very fascinating. But as a human, it's not my place to say. It's not my place to say what Catholics should do, shouldn't do, ought to do, whatever. So what I wanted to do was focus on not the politics of Pope Leo the 14th. Is that right? Did I get it?
Yes. Yes.
All right. Leo XIV. I didn't want to focus on him and who he is and what he represents in terms of this battle, but I wanted to look at who Catholics in America are politically and how they vote. You are 100% right so in the 1972 election, it was considered remarkable that Richard Nixon would do so well that he might get 40% of the Catholic vote. This is like, wow, cannot believe it. Cannot believe it. Then you observe from the mid-70s onward, the political salience of Catholicism, or the skew of Catholicism or Catholics, sort of goes away. And Catholics become, by the time we get to the 21st century, Catholics vote pretty much like the rest of the population. There isn't a political salience there.
No, the religion doesn't line up with one particular political party.
Whoever wins, you saw in 2000, 2004, 2008, 12, 16, 20, whoever won, and also in 24, just the margin was higher. Whoever won the national popular vote also won the Catholic vote. It wasn't like it was 60 and 50 years ago, where even losing Democratic candidates would get the lion's share of self-described Roman Catholic voters. I don't know when the Sammons arrived from County Mayo, but I can tell you that when my mother's people, the McCarthys, arrived in the late 19th century, being a Democrat, and they arrived in New York State, upstate New York. When they arrived, there was no idea that there was such a thing as a Republican Irish immigrant or a Republican who was a child of an Irish immigrant. There were different sects within the Democratic Party where Irish people clustered. There were Bourbon Democrats who were more well-heeled. There were Tammany Hall ward heeler kinds of Democrats. There were, those were class distinctions. But basically, every Irish American, for statistical purposes, if you met somebody who was Irish or the child or grandchild of Irish immigrants, this was going to be a Democrat, and that was true from the time that Democrats started, that Irish people started arriving in large numbers in the 1840s. You also get
people used to talk about the shanty Irish or the
lace curtains. That's right. So you had Bourbon Democrats and you had Tammany Hall Democrats in New York. The German immigrants who came in the late 1840s were different. They were mostly Republicans. They were actually the founding bloc of the Republican Party. Were these small R Republican emigres from Germany who came to the United States, and they were the catalyst from turning the Whigs into the Republicans. But you get to every subsequent wave of immigrants that comes until, well, actually now, but every subsequent wave of immigration, including all the Ellis Island immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, a lot of them were Jewish, some of them were Greek Orthodox, but most of them were Catholic. Poles and Italians, Czechs, Slovaks, Slovenes, you name it. And those folks followed suit. And they were Democrats and Catholics. Were they Democrats because they were Catholics, or were they Catholics because they were Democrats, or were the two things just, was it coincidence? I believe that the Democratic Party, and this was the bargain that was hammered out in the 1930s during the New Deal, the bargain was, we can accommodate a sort of social justice teaching inside of the Democratic Party that will align with the broad teachings of the Catholic Church, and everybody can be happy together. Over time, what happens? Being the child or grandchild of an immigrant gets you closely connected to a community where you grew up. It gets you closely connected to your cultural and ethnic roots. Great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, you sure don't live in the old neighborhood anymore, right?
Yeah.
And you have probably climbed the socioeconomic ladder. You have perhaps become a Republican, or at least what Republicans were in the old days. My grandfather was a person who had 3 pictures on the wall inside of his home. It was a picture. Well, he was even better.
Oh, that was before. Yeah. Okay.
No. It's even better than that. He had the Pope. He had Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he had a picture of himself on the deck of a reconstructed PT-109 in full acknowledgement. It's like double JFK points. He wrote a letter to JFK to complain about the fact that my mother married my filthy Protestant father. And he wrote a letter to JFK when he was still a senator, lamenting that the kids these days don't understand keeping the old values. My mother was a right-wing Republican, right? She was a Phyllis Schlafly. She was a Barry Goldwater voter. That was 3 generations. And so as the Catholic Church in the United States stagnated, the polity of it became more like just the polity of the country as a whole. If you were rich and you were college educated, you were suburbanite, you were affluent, you were more likely to be a Republican. If you're working class, blue collar, you're more likely to be a Democrat, regardless of anything else.
Then something now that may be switching, but you talked about your mom being a right-wing Republican. My mom was a lifelong Democrat, and probably 20 years ago, I had a political conversation with her, as I did from time to time, and I said, "Mom, let's go through the issues. Let's just do an exercise here. I just want to get you on the record on the issues." And I went through abortion. Oh no, taxation. Well, it should be lower. Defense, whatever it was. I went down 12 issues, and I said, "Mom, you're kind of a Republican." And she said, "Oh no, I'm a Democrat." And I said, "Well, but," she said, "leaving the Democratic Party would be like leaving the Catholic Church to me." And I didn't quite understand it. I will say, having read your column this morning, I have a little bit greater understanding of what she meant, because there was a time when those two things were more closely linked. the Catholicism and a political outlook.
And the Republican Party had been rooted in, so the know nothings of the 19th century, the Millard Fillmore nativists, and then you have the rise of the Northern Klan, which in places like Indiana and elsewhere was a Republican operation, not the old Klan of the Deep South that was heavily Democratic. The Northern Klan, like the Know Nothings that came before it, was deeply rooted in anti-Catholic bigotry. It was the the old saw. I believe it was a bishop, an Episcopal bishop, who described the Democratic Party as the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion, which is to say, and what was Prohibition about? Prohibition was about a lot of things, but it was about anti-immigrant bias because the Germans, many of whom were Catholic, and the Irish were stereotyped as drunkards, and that they were bringing this terrible conduct, and alcoholism to the pure Albion seed on America's shores. The argument for Prohibition was the reason the temperance movement that had been around for all of American history had its success was that it got married up to nativism, anti-immigrant sentiment. The attitude among the folks like your mom were, in the same way that for Black voters, Republican opposition to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act became we'll never go back. We'll never go back. You've broken trust with us, and we're never going back. And it takes a long time for that stuff to work its way through. And now, as you allude to, well, the in-between step is, so Catholics were 25% of the population. When you were born, Catholics were 25% of the population. Now Catholics are 20% of the population, and that decline happened in the 80s and into the 90s. But then it was arrested. And the Catholic share of the population continues to be about 1 in 5 adults, and it's been very consistent this century. Who are those people? Those people are younger, they are Hispanic, they are Asian, they are in the South and the West. The old Catholic Church in America, which was rooted in New York, Boston, Cleveland, Chicago, those places, has the population shifted.
The older, whiter, northern, eastern
Yep.
has given way to a younger, Hispanic, Asian, moving increasingly to the south, increasingly to the west.
Yep. And what progressives, both Catholic progressives, people who wanted to liberalize the church, and Democrats generally believed, because this was the article of faith, if you'll pardon me, inside the Democratic Party in sort of the pre-Obama and Obama era, which is that as the country gets younger and as the country gets less white, that it will become less Republican, because these new people, they'll be less conservatives. And my American Enterprise Institute colleague, Rui Teixeira, wrote the most overinterpreted book in American political history, The Emerging Democratic Majority, where he and John Judas wrote a book that said, look, if Democrats can hold on to the white working class, these changes in demography are going to bring along this new coalition for Democrats that are going to be great. And Democrats just said, well, we're going to win. Their takeaway from the book was, we can't lose. They didn't read the hard part. And a lot of people thought the Catholic Church would liberalize in America because it was going to get younger and less white. Because if the old white Catholics are the conservative ones, then it's going to get more liberal. What we saw in 2024, and these are imperfect exit poll data, no question. But if it's even directionally right, if that 20-point advantage, if you go from Joe Biden winning Catholic voters by 5 points to Donald Trump winning Catholic voters by 20 points in 2024, that could be a lot of things, and we don't want to overinterpret that. But it points to the fallacy that both right-wingers and left-wingers had, both on theological questions and political questions, that less white and younger means more progressive and more left. I think that is not true. I don't know whether Republicans can keep that coalition, but you see something happening for Republicans. or might happen for Republicans that is not dissimilar to what happened for Democrats 3 and 4 generations ago, which is
Just
and it's crazy to say that Republicans could become the party of immigrant and or children of immigrants and grandchildren of immigrants, maybe in the way that Democrats were a century ago.
yes, that's what I was going to ask you because, we've talked a lot in the wake of the November election about how Republicans have increasingly become the party of the working class, which was so striking just on its own. But when you fold in the dimension of religion and you talk about Catholics and you talk about, well, could the Republican Party start to lock up the Catholic vote as a reliable voting bloc in the way that the Democrats did 50, 60 years ago? And I know we're not quite there yet, and it might go in a different direction, but it at least looked possible that that could happen. And let me just to say one last thing about we talk about our parents. It's not just that the people moving away ideologically from political parties, but the political parties have changed. And one of the things I said to my mom was, I said, it it wasn't so much that you're leaving the Democratic Party. It's sort of the Democratic Party left you because the Democratic Party of JFK is a lot different than the Democratic Party of AOC. And by the way, you talk about Catholics and you talk about 2028 coming up, and you think of, I know it's early, but it's never too early for us at the Hill or at News Nation to speculate about the 2028 presidential election. But you think about it. Look on the Republican side. Who are the front runners to be the nominee on the Republican side? A lot can happen, right? But you'd have to say at this snapshot in time, at this moment in time, you'd have to say that J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio would be
Donald Trump,
clearly
so.
the two leading front runners. They're both Catholic. Now, Rubio is a Catholic by birth, and J.D. Vance is a converted Catholic. And the thing about converted Catholics is sometimes they have the zeal of the freshly converted. I have a son-in-law who converted to Catholicism, and this guy is just lapping us, us natural-born Catholics. I mean, this guy's probably at church right now, and puts us all to shame. So you have Catholics that could be, you could have an election. Who knows if AOC or whoever the Democrats nominate? How will that play out? As if what you're saying proves out. In other words, if the Republicans vote increasingly Catholic, how would that play out in 2028?
Well, I love the Kurt Vonnegut line. We are what we pretend to be, so we should be careful about what we pretend to be. I think it would be reasonable right now to say that the Republican Party is pretending to be a working class party. When you look at the data on who says they're working class among Republicans, more than half of college-educated Republicans call themselves working class. 60% of Republicans who are in the highest income bracket say that they are working class. So I think it's a vibe, not a real thing. But when you look at the policies, right, you look at protectionism, you look at the idea of high tariffs, that's a left idea, not a right idea. And it is a working class idea. It's something that's very popular with working class folks. Tough on crime. Yep, that is a big issue for the poor and the working poor, and a host of issues where Republicans are moving it. Donald Trump's talking about jacking up taxes on the highest income earners, and Republicans have been pretending to be working class, but they could end up actually being working class. The real question is, and we see the movement happening for Republicans. The real question is, can Democrats accept the other role, right? Because the problem that Democrats have is the old Republican coalition is deeply dependent on Protestant or irreligious or whatever, affluent, college-educated suburbanites. That was in the Bush and the Reagan, and that was the bedrock. That's how they had an 0.8 of a point advantage in midterm elections. High propensity, affluent, college-educated, or aspirational voters. Democrats need those voters, but they're very attached to the idea of being the working class party. So can we see a full switcheroo if we do, we'll see it in the Catholic vote, right? We'll see it whether if Democrats are able to do this, they've got to, just as Republicans would need to continue to do big numbers with Catholic voters, Democrats are going to have to start getting the old WASPs back. They're going to have to, they're going to have to reinvent themselves. And I don't know whether this migration that started in 2016 with Trump continues, or whether there's a snapback, or how it goes. But certainly there's a lot of evidence that if you read between the lines among Catholic voters, simply because of the demography, the great cross-section of political demography that you get, not that being Catholic makes you Republican or makes you Democratic, but what it tells us about these voters, that you can see the trend line there, where you could end up with a sort of left nationalist Republican Party that is populistic and kind of progressive on economic issues, and a sort of liberal in the classical sense of liberal, smaller government, less intervention, lower taxes, lower tariff Democratic Party. Stranger things have happened in American politics.
Perhaps not so different than Pope Leo XIV. But, one last question on religion and demographics, Chris. You point out that in America today, 20% of Americans identify as Catholic, 40%, I'm sorry, 40% of Americans identify as Protestant, and then we have about 30% basically non-believers. So that's basically 90% of the country, and then you have some other religions. And
about 7% combined for the smaller groups.
Well, what I want to drill down on is the 20% of Catholics as compared to 40% of Protestants. You make the distinction between old line Protestants and evangelical Protestants.
Yeah,
and when you look at it that way, and for example, Catholics as compared to old line Protestants, you make the argument that those have kind of reversed a little bit, because it used to be that old line Protestants were more dominant than Catholics, and now the reverse is the case.
We prefer the term mainline. Don't make me feel old. Don't make me feel older than
You're right. I misspoke.
Okay, so
Because I'm a Catholic.
23%, 24% of American adults identify themselves as evangelical Christians, and 11 or 12% identify as mainline Protestant. And those are the traditional denominations. Now, the tricky thing, and this is another advantage that Roman Catholics have. You guys are Starbucks. You're McDonald's. You're everywhere. And it's basically the same thing. One place may have a playland. One place may have cleaner bathrooms and a easier to remember bathroom code than another. But wherever you go in the world, you will find a Starbucks, you will find a McDonald's, and you'll basically get the same thing. Protestantism, like it always has been in America, is a wild and woolly space in which, so I go to a church that is a mainline denomination. I go to an Anglican church. But if you were to survey the people there and say, are you an evangelical Protestant? Many of them would say yes, in the sense that, like Billy Graham and other evangelical leaders, the part of the problem we have in this is a bugaboo of mine. In religious demography, we got the chocolate and the peanut butter. What does it mean to be an evangelical? 40 years ago, there was a clear answer, a much clearer answer among Christians. Now it's much fuzzier. And what evangelical often means now is just very, or white, or I'm a Republican, right? We saw this when we were looking at the data come in 2016 in the primaries, where we're looking at these data, trying to make calls and looking at the exit polling, and people are saying, yeah, I'm an evangelical Christian. How often do you attend church? Almost never. Wait, what? And we in the politics world screwed up the usefulness of that term. But when you put everybody together, you are at about 40%. But the numbers have declined dramatically over time, where the numbers of Catholics have been consistent, because Catholics have benefited from this extraordinary wave of immigration from the 1980s to the 2010s, basically, is when it really got cooking, of Hispanic immigrants, a lot of whom are becoming evangelical too. But the Catholic Church benefited enormously from this infusion of younger immigrant folks, just in the same way that the Catholic Church, always in American history, for 170 years, has benefited.
Chris, I always like to hit you with a piece of music trivia. And,
Right.
I think the last time I was talking to you, you jokingly, ironically suggested, well, what are you going to ask me about Bachman Turner Overdrive, which I know neither of us have any particular affinity for, but
Rough.
it's a thing. Bachman Turner Overdrive, or it was a thing. So my question to you, and I don't necessarily expect anyone to have, I wouldn't have gotten the answer to this, but here's my question. What was their only number one hit here in America? Bachman Turner Overdrive, ladies and gentlemen,
Well, first of all,
in the 70s.
Bachman Turner Overdrive now banned because of their Canadianness. There's a tariff now for listening to Bachman Turner Overdrive. They've been tariffed. I want to say that it's taken care of business, but I feel
That's what I would have guessed.
but I didn't say that. I didn't say that. But I'm going to say it's the weird track, You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet.
You are absolutely correct. It is their number one hit. And I'll give you one other additional piece of trivia. That album from which that song is called Not Fragile. And the reason they named that album Not Fragile was because Randy Bachman was reacting to, believe it or not, Chris, a Yes album titled Fragile, which contained the song Roundabout. And he was making the statement, well, this Yes music is so, it's so fancy and it's prog rock, and we're going to make straight
dumb music. We're bringing dumb.
We could throw our music on the floor and it still takes a licking and keeps on ticking. So that's your trivia moment for today. Chris, I think we're out of time now. Thank you so much. But I want to ask you, what do you have coming up on the Hill Sunday show on News Nation this weekend?
We have a very important guest. We have Tom Cole, who is the lead appropriator in the House of Representatives. They are urgently trying to put together this tax and spending deal. Nobody has more to say about it than Tom Cole, and he's going to come talk to us, and it will be worth listening to.
That's all the time we have for Whole Hog Politics. Join us next time. Until then, I'm Bill Sammon with Chris Stirewalt.
You ain't seen nothing yet.